Welcome to No Sleep Historian, where the past never rests, and neither can you. They didn't wear masks, they wore lab coats. They didn't kill with weapons, they used scalpels, electricity, and ideology. These aren't horror stories, they're peer-reviewed nightmares with government funding. In a world obsessed with progress, there were those who pushed science beyond the ethical, beyond the legal, and sometimes beyond the human. You've heard of Frankenstein, but these scientists weren't fiction. They walked into morgues, prisons, and battlefields and asked, what if we go one step further? This is the true story of men who weren't just mad, they were methodical. Part 1. Ilya Ivanov, the man who tried to make human-ape hybrids. In the chaos of post-revolutionary Russia, when the Soviet Union was struggling to establish its identity as a beacon of scientific progress, one biologist embarked on an experiment so audacious that it would have been considered madness in any other era. Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, born in the town of Shigary in 1870, was a respected zoology professor who received substantial Soviet government financing in the mid-1920s for a project that defied both scientific ethics and human dignity. His goal was nothing less than the creation of a human-ape hybrid through artificial insemination. Ivanov's path to this controversial experiment began with legitimate scientific achievements. He graduated from Kharkiv University in 1896 and became a professor in 1907, establishing himself as a pioneer in artificial insemination techniques. His early work with horses and other domestic animals had earned him international recognition and positioned him as one of Russia's leading experts in reproductive biology. His later experiments were some of the earliest successes in interspecific hybridization, creating combinations like guinea pig-mouse hybrids, mouse-rat crosses, cantaloupe combinations, zebra-donkey hybrids, known as zebrats, and the zebra-horse hybrid called Azores. The Soviet government's interest in Ivanov's hybrid project stemmed from the revolutionary fervor of the era. There were many projects aimed at changing humanity. Historian Alexander Etkind explains, Ivanov's was the most extreme, but if he succeeded, then that would show that humans could be changed in radical and creative ways. The Bolsheviks, desperate to prove their scientific superiority over Western nations, were willing to fund even the most outrageous experiments if they promised to demonstrate Soviet ingenuity. The theoretical foundation for Ivanov's work rested on the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin, which suggested a close relationship between humans and apes. He felt that creating a human-ape hybrid was clearly possible given how successful he had been in his animal experiments and how close evolutionary biologists then regarded apes and humans. The scientific community of the 1920s was far more optimistic about the possibilities of cross-species reproduction than modern geneticists would be, lacking the chromosomal knowledge that would later reveal the impossibility of such hybridization. Between 1926 and 1927, Ivanov led an expedition to West Africa to obtain specimens for experiments on human-ape hybrids. The journey to French Guinea was fraught with difficulties. The colonial authorities were initially suspicious of the Soviet scientists' intentions, and the logistics of capturing and transporting live chimpanzees proved more challenging than anticipated. The tropical climate took its toll on both the research team and their equipment, while local political tensions made their work increasingly precarious. Once in Africa, Ivanov set up a makeshift laboratory where he attempted to inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm. The experiments were conducted under primitive conditions, without proper medical facilities or ethical oversight. He attempted to inseminate 3 female chimpanzees with human sperm, but the procedures were largely unsuccessful due to both technical limitations and the animals' resistance to the invasive procedures. The failure of the African experiments did not deter Ivanov. His facilities in Sukhumi had their own animals, allowing him to shift from equines to primates. The Sukhumi Primate Research Center, established on the Black Sea coast, became the new headquarters for his hybrid experiments. Here, with better equipment and a more controlled environment, Ivanov continued his attempts to create human-ape hybrids. The most disturbing aspect of Ivanov's research was his willingness to experiment on human subjects. When his attempts to inseminate chimpanzees with human sperm failed, he proposed the reverse procedure, sourcing human women to carry chimp embryos. This plan required finding women willing to undergo artificial insemination with ape sperm, a proposal that even the Soviet authorities found ethically problematic. The search for volunteers proved nearly impossible, as few women were willing to participate in such a dangerous and degrading experiment. Ivanov's work was conducted in secrecy, but rumors of his experiments began to circulate throughout the Soviet scientific community. The international press occasionally picked up stories about the Red Scientist attempting to create hybrid beings, leading to both fascination and revulsion in equal measure. Western newspapers sensationalized the reports, often exaggerating the scope and success of the experiments for dramatic effect. The scientific methodology behind Ivanov's work was deeply flawed by modern standards. He lacked understanding of genetic compatibility, chromosomal differences, and the complex biological barriers that prevent interspecies reproduction between distantly related mammals. Humans have 46 chromosomes, while chimpanzees have 48, a fundamental incompatibility that makes successful hybridization impossible. Even if fertilization had occurred, the resulting embryos would have been non-viable due to chromosomal abnormalities. Unfortunately for Ivanov, none of his experiments ever worked. As the 1920s progressed and his repeated failures mounted, Soviet support for the project began to wane. The government had invested significant resources in the hybrid program, but the lack of results made it increasingly difficult to justify continued funding. Political winds were also shifting as Stalin consolidated power and became more suspicious of scientists with international connections. The end came swiftly for Ivanov's research program. In 1930, he was arrested on charges of participating in a counter-revolutionary conspiracy, though the real reason was likely his failure to produce the promised results and his increasingly strained relationship with Soviet authorities. Although he was released the following year, he remained in exile in Kazakhstan and died of a stroke in 1932. Soviet attempts to create a human-chimpanzee hybrid died with him. The legacy of Ivanov's work extends far beyond his failed experiments. His research highlighted the dangerous intersection of scientific ambition and political ideology, showing how authoritarian regimes could exploit scientific curiosity for propaganda purposes. The ethical questions raised by his work regarding consent, human dignity, and the limits of scientific inquiry remain relevant today as genetic engineering technologies advance. Modern scientists have created viable human-animal chimeras for medical research, but these involve cellular-level integration rather than reproductive hybridization. Despite advancements in science, with a viable human monkey embryo created as recently as 2019, The moral and ethical concerns surrounding such research continue to generate controversy. The memory of Ivanov's crude attempts serves as a reminder of the importance of ethical oversight in scientific research. Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov was a controversial scientist and researcher. Although he couldn't fulfill his dream, his story remains one of the most bizarre chapters in the history of Soviet science, a testament to the dangerous combination of unlimited ambition and unlimited power. Part 2. Giovanni Aldini, the resurrectionist with a battery. On a cold January morning in 1803, a crowd gathered at the Royal College of Surgeons in London to witness what many believed could be the most significant scientific breakthrough in human history. The college had invited Professor Giovanni Aldini to carry out galvanic experiments on the body of George Foster, who had been found guilty of murdering his wife and child by drowning them in the Paddington Canal. Foster, just 26 years old, had been executed by hanging earlier that morning, and his still warm corpse was about to become the subject of an experiment that would blur the line between science and spectacle. Aldini was a keen proponent of his uncle's work, of using electricity to stimulate the muscles in dead frogs, and sought to develop this method further, experimenting with a variety of dead animals. Luigi Galvani had discovered what he termed animal electricity in the 1780s, observing that dead frogs' legs would twitch when touched with different metals. This phenomenon sparked one of the most heated scientific debates of the era, pitting Galvani against Alessandro Volta in a controversy that would reshape understanding of electricity itself. Italian physicist Alessandro Volta repeated Galvani's experiments, but concluded that the two metals alone were responsible for the electric charge, and that certain fluids could conduct electricity. He denied Galvani's theory of animal electricity, and thus began one of science's most famous disputes. The Galvani versus Volta debate would eventually prove both scientists partially correct. But in the early 1800s, the argument raged with religious fervor among Europe's intellectual elite. Giovanni Aldini inherited more than just his uncle's scientific theories. He possessed an almost evangelical belief in electricity's power to restore life. Where Galvani had been content with laboratory observations, Aldini craved public demonstration and dramatic proof. The public loved it: sparks, disembodied limbs, and the promise of reanimation. Aldini understood that science in the early 19th century was as much about theater as it was about discovery. In his demonstrations, Aldini began with the carcasses of oxen and deer, attempting to show that animal electricity still resided in the dead flesh. These preliminary experiments, conducted across Europe in university halls and anatomical theaters, established his reputation as both a serious scientist and a masterful showman. Audiences watched in fascination and horror as dead animals appeared to twitch with renewed life under the influence of electrical current. The technology that made Aldini's experiments possible had only recently been invented. Volta's findings led him to develop the first battery capable of a continuous electrical current, known as the voltaic pile. In 1800, composed of a stack of alternating discs of copper and zinc separated by cardboard soaked in brine, it was a game changer. This device provided Aldini with a reliable source of electrical current, far more powerful and consistent than the static electricity generators that had been used in previous decades. The George Foster experiment represented the culmination of Aldini's ambitions. Aldini required access to the bodies of people who had died very recently, as he believed that the vital spark remained in recently deceased tissue. The timing had to be perfect. Too much delay would allow the mysterious force to dissipate beyond recovery. Foster's execution provided the ideal opportunity, with death occurring mere hours before the experimental procedure. In 1803, Aldini performed a famous public demonstration of the electrostimulation technique of deceased limbs on the corpse of an executed criminal, George Foster, at Newgate in London. The scene that unfolded that day would haunt the imagination of witnesses for decades to come. As Aldini applied electrical current to various parts of Foster's body, the corpse began to move in ways that defied the observer's understanding of death. Promptly, upon being declared dead, his corpse was carted off to the Royal College of Surgeons to participate in what would become one of the most notorious experiments in medical history. The corpse convulsed violently when electrical current was applied. Its eyes opened wide and seemed to stare at the assembled crowd, and the jaw moved repeatedly, as if Foster were attempting to speak from beyond the grave. Some witnesses swore they saw consciousness flicker behind the dead man's eyes. The reactions of the audience ranged from scientific fascination to absolute terror. Several spectators fainted at the sight of the animated corpse, while others fled the building entirely. One observer reportedly died of shock, though this account may be apocryphal. The experiment created such a sensation that newspapers across Europe reported on Aldini's resurrection of George Foster, often with sensationalized accounts that amplified both the drama and the supposed success of the procedure. Aldini himself was convinced that he had achieved something miraculous. Like Dr. Frankenstein, Aldini's grisly experiments sought to prove that it's possible to revive the dead. He believed that death was merely the cessation of electrical activity in the body, and that by restoring this activity, life itself could be rekindled. This mechanistic view of life and death was revolutionary for its time, challenging religious and philosophical assumptions about the nature of human existence. Though a showman in many respects, Aldini was among the first to treat mentally ill patients with shocks to the brain, reporting complete electrical cures for a number of mental illnesses. His medical applications of electricity extended far beyond reanimation experiments. He claimed remarkable success in treating melancholia, mania, and other psychiatric conditions through carefully applied electrical stimulation. While his methods were crude by modern standards, Aldini was pioneering what would eventually become electroconvulsive therapy. These experiments were described in details in Aldini's book, published in London in 1803, an account of the late improvements in galvanism, with a series of curious and interesting experiments performed before the commissioners of the French National Institute, and repeated lately in the anatomical theaters of London by John Aldini. It was an influential book on galvanism. This publication established Aldini as the leading authority on medical applications of electricity and spread his theories throughout the scientific community. The theoretical foundation of Aldini's work rested on the belief that life itself was fundamentally electrical in nature. He theorized that what distinguished living tissue from dead matter was the presence of galvanic fluid, a form of electricity that animated organic material. According to this theory, death occurred when this electrical force was depleted or disrupted, but it could potentially be restored through external application of electrical current. Aldini's experiments attracted international attention from both the scientific community and government officials. Various European courts invited him to demonstrate his techniques, seeing potential military applications for soldiers who had died in battle. The prospect of reviving fallen warriors captured the imagination of generals and kings. Though Aldini's methods never progressed beyond causing muscular contractions in corpses, the ethical implications of Aldini's work were largely ignored in his era. But they would later inspire profound questions about the nature of death and the limits of medical intervention. His experiments raised fundamental questions about when death actually occurs, and whether the cessation of heartbeat and breathing truly represented the end of life. These questions remain relevant today as medical technology allows for the maintenance of biological functions long after consciousness has departed. Despite his dramatic public demonstrations, Aldini never actually succeeded in reviving a dead person. The muscular contractions and apparent movements he produced in corpses were purely mechanical responses to electrical stimulation, not signs of restored life. However, his work laid important groundwork for the development of defibrillation, cardiac pacemakers, and other life-saving electrical devices that are commonplace in modern medicine. Frankenstein might look like fantasy to modern eyes, but to its author and original readers, there was nothing fantastic about it. Mary Shelley's famous novel, published in 1818, drew direct inspiration from Aldini's experiments and the broader galvanism movement. The idea of using electricity to animate dead tissue was not science fiction in the early 19th century, but cutting-edge scientific research that seemed to promise revolutionary breakthroughs. Aldini's legacy extends far beyond his failed attempts at resurrection. His systematic study of electricity's effects on living tissue contributed to the foundations of neurophysiology and bioelectricity. Modern understanding of nerve conduction, muscle contraction, and cardiac rhythm all trace their origins partly to the work of Aldini and his contemporaries in the galvanism movement. The story of Giovanni Aldini serves as a reminder that the line between scientific inquiry and theatrical spectacle has always been thin. His experiments, while ultimately unsuccessful in their primary goal, demonstrated the power of public science communication and the dangers of allowing ambition to outpace ethical consideration. In an age when the boundaries of scientific possibility seemed limitless, Aldini pushed those boundaries further than perhaps anyone dared, seeking nothing less than victory over death itself. Part 3. Robert Cornish. He killed dogs, then brought them back. In the sterile confines of a University of California laboratory during the 1930s, Dr. Robert Cornish embarked on a series of experiments that would challenge humanity's most fundamental assumption about the finality of death. Unlike the theatrical spectacles of Giovanni Aldini or the crude hybrid attempts of Ilya Ivanov, Cornish approached resurrection with the methodical precision of modern scientific inquiry. His systematic attempts to revive the dead using a combination of mechanical devices, pharmaceutical interventions, and sheer determination would earn him both scientific notoriety and ethical condemnation. Robert Cornish arrived at the University of California, Berkeley, with impeccable credentials and an unconventional mind. Trained in traditional medicine, but fascinated by the emerging fields of physiology and pharmacology, he possessed the technical expertise necessary to design sophisticated revival systems. His interest in death and resurrection wasn't purely academic. Cornish was driven by a profound belief that death represented merely a temporary cessation of biological function rather than an irreversible state of being. The theoretical foundation for Cornish's work rested on advances in understanding circulation, metabolism, and cellular biology, that had emerged in the early decades of the 20th century. Scientists had discovered that individual cells could survive for extended periods after clinical death, suggesting that the boundary between life and death might be more fluid than previously believed. Cornish theorized that if circulation could be restored quickly enough, and if cellular damage could be minimized or reversed, then death itself might be conquerable. Cornish's revival system was an engineering marvel that combined multiple therapeutic approaches into a single, coordinated intervention. The centerpiece was a mechanical apparatus using pulleys and counterweights, designed to restore circulation through rhythmic compression and decompression of the body. This primitive form of external cardiac massage was supplemented by careful injection of stimulants, particularly adrenaline, to jumpstart cardiac function. Anticoagulants were administered to prevent blood clotting, while oxygen was supplied to minimize brain damage during the revival process. The experimental protocol developed by Cornish was methodical and reproducible. Dogs were selected as test subjects due to their physiological similarity to humans and their availability for laboratory research. Each animal was first anesthetized to minimize suffering, then systematically killed through controlled asphyxiation or cardiac arrest. The timing of death was precisely measured, as Cornish had determined that successful revival became increasingly unlikely as time elapsed after clinical death. The revival procedure itself was a carefully choreographed dance of mechanical manipulation and pharmaceutical intervention. Immediately after confirming death, the animal was positioned on Cornish's revival apparatus, which began rhythmic compressions designed to maintain minimal circulation. Adrenaline was injected directly into the heart to stimulate cardiac muscle, while anticoagulants prevented the formation of blood clots that could block circulation. Oxygen was administered through artificial respiration to supply the brain and other vital organs. Cornish claimed remarkable success with his revival techniques, reporting that he had successfully brought multiple dogs back from clinical death. The animals, he insisted, showed clear signs of restored consciousness, responsiveness to stimuli, and apparently normal behavior following their resurrection. These claims generated significant controversy within the scientific community, with some colleagues questioning both the methodology and the ethics of the experiments. The most famous of Cornish's subjects was a dog named Lazarus, whose supposed resurrection became the subject of intense media attention. According to Cornish's accounts, Lazarus was killed through controlled asphyxiation, remained clinically dead for several minutes, then was successfully revived using the pulley system and pharmaceutical interventions. The dog allegedly recovered completely, showing no apparent ill effects from its journey to and from death. However, skeptical observers raised serious questions about Cornish's claims and methodology. The definition of clinical death in the 1930s was less precise than modern standards, relying primarily on cessation of heartbeat and breathing, rather than more sophisticated measures of brain activity or cellular function. Critics argued that Cornish's subjects may never have been truly dead in the first place, but merely in states of deep unconsciousness or cardiac arrest from which recovery was possible through conventional resuscitation techniques. The scientific community's response to Cornish's work was mixed, with enthusiasm from some quarters balanced by skepticism and condemnation from others. Supporters saw his research as pioneering work that could revolutionize emergency medicine and trauma care. The possibility of bringing accident victims back from clinical death held enormous promise for reducing mortality rates and saving lives that would otherwise be lost to injury or sudden illness. Opposition to Cornish's research came from multiple sources, including religious leaders who viewed resurrection as divine prerogative, ethicists concerned about the treatment of experimental animals, and scientists who questioned the validity of his results. The repeated killing and attempted revival of laboratory animals raised serious concerns about unnecessary suffering and the limits of acceptable research methodology. Despite the controversy surrounding his animal experiments, Cornish was determined to test his revival techniques on human subjects. He believed that the principles proven effective in dogs would translate directly to human physiology, offering hope for countless victims of accidents, heart attacks, and other sudden causes of death. The potential medical applications seemed limitless, from emergency room interventions to battlefield medicine. Cornish's ambitions led him to petition authorities for permission to test his revival system on human corpses, specifically requesting access to the bodies of freshly executed prisoners. He argued that condemned criminals who had already forfeited their lives to the state represented ideal test subjects for resurrection research. The bodies would be fresh, the timing of death precisely known, and the legal complications minimal, since the subjects had already been legally declared dead. The request to experiment on executed prisoners generated intense public debate about the ethics of resurrection research and the rights of the dead. Critics argued that subjecting executed criminals to experimental revival procedures violated basic human dignity and represented a form of post-mortem torture. The prospect of bringing condemned murderers back from death raised disturbing questions about the finality of legal execution and the possibility of creating unwilling subjects for scientific experimentation. Prison officials and legal authorities were deeply uncomfortable with Cornish's proposals, recognizing the unprecedented ethical and legal complications that would arise from attempted human resurrection. The legal system was predicated on the assumption that death was final and irreversible. Successful revival of executed criminals would undermine fundamental assumptions about justice, punishment, and the nature of legal death. Despite his persistent efforts, Cornish was never granted permission to conduct revival experiments on human subjects. The combination of ethical concerns, legal complications, and scientific skepticism created insurmountable barriers to human testing. University administrators, facing mounting pressure from critics and concerned about institutional reputation, eventually restricted his research activities and limited his access to laboratory facilities. The failure to secure human test subjects marked the beginning of the end for Cornish's resurrection research. Without the ability to demonstrate successful human revival, his claims about animal resurrection remained scientifically unverified and increasingly irrelevant to practical medical applications. The scientific community gradually lost interest in his work as more conventional approaches to cardiac resuscitation proved more reliable and ethically acceptable. Modern analysis of Cornish's experimental protocols suggests that his revival techniques may have had some legitimate scientific merit. Despite the controversial methods and exaggerated claims, the mechanical circulation assistance he developed anticipated modern cardiopulmonary resuscitation techniques, while his use of pharmaceutical interventions paralleled contemporary emergency medicine approaches. However, his understanding of brain death and cellular damage was limited by the scientific knowledge available in his era. The legacy of Robert Cornish's resurrection research extends beyond his specific experimental results to broader questions about the boundaries of scientific inquiry and the ethics of life and death research. His work highlighted the tension between scientific ambition and ethical restraint, demonstrating how the pursuit of knowledge could conflict with moral considerations about the treatment of both animal and human subjects. Contemporary medical science has achieved many of the goals that Cornish pursued through his resurrection research, though through more conventional and ethically acceptable means. Modern cardiac resuscitation techniques, defibrillation devices, and advanced life support systems regularly bring patients back from clinical death, fulfilling Cornish's vision of conquering mortality through scientific intervention. The story of Robert Cornish serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition and the importance of ethical oversight in medical research. His genuine desire to save lives and advance medical knowledge was undermined by questionable methodology, exaggerated claims, and insufficient consideration of ethical implications. While his specific approach to resurrection research proved unsuccessful, his work contributed to the broader development of resuscitation medicine and emergency care techniques that continue to save lives today. Part 4. Shur-Ishi, Unit 731, and the Biology of Cruelty. In the remote mountains of Manchuria, far from the scrutiny of international observers and hidden behind layers of military secrecy, Lieutenant General Shur-Ishi constructed what may have been the most horrific medical research facility in human history. Between 1937 and 1945, Unit 731 of the Imperial Japanese Army conducted experiments on human subjects that defied every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. The scale, systematic nature, and scientific methodology applied to these atrocities created a unique horror in the annals of human cruelty. Shur-Ishi was born into a prosperous farming family in Chiba Prefecture in 1892, showing exceptional academic ability from an early age. He graduated from Kyoto Imperial University's medical school in 1920, specializing in microbiology and serology. His early career appeared conventional, focusing on legitimate research into infectious diseases and public health measures. However, Ishii possessed an ambitious personality and ruthless pragmatism that would eventually manifest in unthinkable ways. The origins of Unit 731 can be traced to Japan's growing militarism in the 1930s and the recognition that biological warfare could provide strategic advantages in the nation's expanding conflicts. Ishii convinced military leaders that biological weapons research was essential for national defense, arguing that other nations were already developing such capabilities. His persuasive abilities and scientific credentials earned him command of what would officially be known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The facility, constructed in Pingfang, near Harbin, in occupied Manchuria, was a massive complex covering over 6 square kilometers, officially described as a lumber mill and public health facility. Unit 731 actually contained sophisticated laboratories, breeding facilities for disease vectors, testing chambers, and a prison complex designed to hold human experimental subjects. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, employing over 3,000 personnel, including physicians, researchers, technicians, and support staff. The human subjects for Ishii's experiments were primarily Chinese civilians, though they also included Soviet prisoners of war, Koreans, and occasionally other nationalities. The victims were dehumanized through the use of coded language, referred to as logs or materials rather than people. This linguistic distancing facilitated the psychological mechanisms that allowed educated physicians and scientists to participate in systematic torture and murder. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 encompassed virtually every aspect of biological warfare research and human physiology. Victims were deliberately infected with diseases including plague, cholera, anthrax, typhus, and other pathogens to study disease progression and test potential treatments. The research was conducted without anesthesia, with subjects often vivisected while still alive to observe the effects of infection on internal organs. Frostbite research represented another major component of Unit 731's activities, motivated by the Japanese military's need to understand cold weather injuries affecting troops in northern China and Siberia. Victims were exposed to extreme cold until frostbite developed, then subjected to various rewarming procedures to determine optimal treatment methods. Body parts were deliberately frozen and thawed repeatedly to study tissue damage and healing processes. The development of biological weapons delivery systems required extensive testing on human subjects to determine optimal dispersal methods and infection rates. Victims were exposed to aerosolized pathogens in sealed chambers, while researchers monitored infection rates, symptom development, and mortality. These experiments provided data on the effectiveness of various delivery mechanisms for biological weapons deployment. Surgical experiments at Unit 731 went far beyond legitimate medical research, involving procedures that had no therapeutic purpose beyond satisfying scientific curiosity. Organs were removed from living subjects without anesthesia. Limbs were amputated and reattached in different positions, and victims were subjected to various forms of deliberate trauma to study healing processes. The systematic nature of these procedures reflected a complete abandonment of medical ethics. The breeding and testing of disease vectors formed another crucial component of Unit 731's research program. Massive facilities were constructed to breed fleas, mosquitoes, and other insects capable of transmitting diseases. These insects were then tested on human subjects to determine their effectiveness as biological weapons delivery systems. The research included studies of optimal breeding conditions, survival rates in various climates, and infection transmission rates. Psychological experiments conducted at Unit 731 explored the effects of stress, deprivation, and torture on human behavior and physiology. Subjects were exposed to extreme temperatures, deprived of food and water, subjected to hypersure chambers, and exposed to various forms of psychological trauma. These studies were designed to understand human limitations and breaking points for military applications. The facility also conducted extensive research into chemical weapons, testing various toxic substances on human subjects to determine lethal doses, symptom progression, and potential countermeasures. Victims were exposed to poison gases, injected with various chemicals, and subjected to other forms of chemical warfare agents. The research provided comprehensive data on chemical weapons effectiveness and human vulnerability. Reproductive experiments at Unit 731 involved forced impregnation of female subjects, followed by various interventions to study fetal development, pregnancy complications, and childbirth under extreme conditions. These experiments included exposure of pregnant subjects to diseases, radiation, and various forms of trauma to observe effects on both mother and fetus. The scale of human destruction at Unit 731 was staggering, with estimates suggesting that over 10,000 people were killed through direct experimentation, while potentially hundreds of thousands more died from diseases deliberately spread by the unit's field testing operations. The systematic nature of the killing, combined with the scientific methodology applied to torture and murder, created a unique form of organized cruelty. Documentation of Unit 731's activities was extensive, with detailed records maintained of experimental procedures, results, and observations. However, as Japan faced defeat in 1945, most of these records were systematically destroyed to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. The destruction of evidence was so thorough that much of what is known about Unit 731's activities comes from post-war testimonies and fragmentary documents that survived the purge. The end of World War II brought the possibility of justice for Unit 731's crimes, but geopolitical considerations intervened to protect many of the perpetrators. The United States, concerned about Soviet expansion and recognizing the potential military value of Unit 731's research data, negotiated secret immunity deals with Ishii and other key personnel in exchange for access to their experimental results. Ishii himself was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for providing detailed information about Unit 731's biological warfare research to American authorities. This decision, made at the highest levels of the U.S. government, prioritized strategic military considerations over justice for the victims of human experimentation. The deal allowed Ishii to live freely in Japan until his death in 1959, never facing trial for his crimes. The biological warfare data obtained from Unit 731 was classified at the highest levels and became part of the United States' own biological weapons research program. The information was considered so valuable that American officials were willing to overlook the horrific methods used to obtain it. This pragmatic approach to war crimes would have lasting implications for international justice and the precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity. The legacy of Unit 731 extends far beyond its immediate victims to raise fundamental questions about the relationship between scientific research and moral responsibility. The facility represented the ultimate perversion of medical science, demonstrating how educated professionals could participate in systematic atrocities when institutional structures and ideological frameworks provided justification for inhumane behavior. The psychological mechanisms that enabled physicians and scientists to participate in Unit 731's activities have been extensively studied by scholars seeking to understand how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil. The gradual escalation of cruelty, the bureaucratic structure that diffused individual responsibility, and the ideological framework that dehumanized victims all contributed to creating conditions where atrocities became routine. Modern medical ethics codes, including the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, were developed partly in response to the revelations about medical experimentation during World War II. The story of Sure Ishii and Unit 731 serves as a perpetual reminder of the potential for scientific knowledge to be perverted into instruments of cruelty and oppression, can produce horrors that exceed the imagination of even the most disturbed individual minds. Part 5. Johann Conrad Dippel, The Real-Life Frankenstein. High on a hill overlooking the Rhine Valley, The imposing towers of Castle Frankenstein have dominated the landscape for over 7 centuries. Within these ancient walls, in the year 1673, was born a man whose experiments with life, death, and the transmigration of souls would inspire one of literature's most enduring monsters. Johann Conrad Dippel, alchemist, physician, and theologian, conducted research so disturbing and controversial that his name became synonymous with the dangerous pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The castle itself provided an appropriately Gothic setting for Dippel's work. Built in the 13th century by the Lords of Frankenstein, the fortress had already accumulated centuries of dark legends by the time of Dippel's birth. Local folklore spoke of supernatural occurrences within the castle walls, unexplained lights in the tower windows, and strange sounds echoing from the depths of the structure. The young Dippel would have grown up surrounded by these stories, perhaps inspiring his later fascination with the boundaries between life and death. Dippel's early education was comprehensive and rigorous, reflecting the intellectual ambitions of his family. He studied theology at the University of Gießen, earning his master's degree in 1693. But his interests extended far beyond conventional religious scholarship. The late 17th century was an era of intellectual ferment, when the boundaries between science, philosophy, and theology were fluid and permeable. Dippel embraced this interdisciplinary approach, combining traditional theological study with emerging scientific methodologies and ancient alchemical practices. The intellectual climate of Dippel's era was characterized by a fascination with the fundamental nature of life and consciousness. The scientific revolution was challenging traditional understanding of the natural world, while alchemical traditions promised the transformation of base materials into precious substances. Dippel saw no contradiction between these approaches, viewing them as complementary paths toward understanding the deepest mysteries of existence. Dippel's theological work was controversial from the beginning, challenging orthodox Christian doctrine with radical interpretations that bordered on heresy. He argued that the soul was material rather than spiritual, a position that placed him in direct conflict with established religious authority. His treatise Papismus, Protestantium Vapulens, attacked both Catholic and Protestant orthodoxy, earning him condemnation from religious leaders across the denominational spectrum. The transition from theology to experimental natural philosophy was gradual but inevitable for Dippel. His materialist understanding of the soul naturally led to questions about the physical mechanisms of consciousness and life. If the soul was indeed material, then it might be subject to manipulation through physical means. This theoretical framework provided the justification for increasingly radical experiments with living and dead tissue. Dippel's alchemical workshop, established in the lower chambers of Castle Frankenstein, became the site of experiments that pushed the boundaries of acceptable natural philosophy. He constructed sophisticated apparatus for distillation, sublimation, and chemical analysis, using techniques that combined traditional alchemical methods with emerging scientific approaches. The workshop's location in the castle's depths provided both secrecy and symbolic appropriateness for work that dealt with the fundamental mysteries of life and death. The development of Dippel's oil, his most famous alchemical creation, represented the culmination of years of experimentation with organic materials. This substance, produced through the destructive distillation of animal bones, blood, and other organic matter, was claimed to possess remarkable medicinal properties. Dippel believed that his oil contained the essential principle of life itself, concentrated and purified through chemical processes. The preparation of Dippel's oil required large quantities of organic raw materials, necessitating a steady supply of animal carcasses and, according to disturbing rumors, human remains. The process involved heating organic matter in sealed retorts until it decomposed into various chemical products, including the dark, oily substance that bore Dippel's name. The smell of these operations was reportedly so intense and unpleasant that it could be detected from miles around the castle. Contemporary accounts describe Dippel's oil as possessing an intensely disagreeable odor and a dark, viscous consistency that suggested its origins in putrefaction and decay, despite its unpalatable characteristics. Dippel promoted the substance as a universal medicine capable of treating virtually any ailment. He claimed that his oil could restore youth, cure diseases, and even extend life indefinitely when properly administered. The theoretical foundation for Dippel's medical claims rested on his belief that life was fundamentally chemical in nature. He theorized that aging and disease resulted from the depletion or corruption of vital chemical principles within the body, and that these could be restored through the administration of substances containing concentrated life force. His oil, distilled from the remains of once living creatures, supposedly contained this essential vitality in purified form. Dippel's experiments extended beyond chemical preparations to direct manipulation of organic tissue. He conducted dissections of both animal and human corpses, seeking to understand the physical basis of life and consciousness. These anatomical investigations were conducted in secret, as such research was generally forbidden by religious and civil authorities, who viewed tampering with corpses as sacrilegious and potentially dangerous. The most disturbing aspect of Dippel's research involved his attempts to transfer souls between bodies, a procedure he believed possible through the proper application of chemical and surgical techniques. According to fragmentary accounts, he attempted to remove what he considered the material soul from recently deceased subjects and implant it in other bodies, both living and dead. The theoretical basis for these experiments derived from his materialist theology and his conviction that consciousness could be manipulated through physical interventions. Rumors circulated throughout the Rhine Valley about Dippel's nocturnal activities, including reports of grave robbing expeditions conducted under cover of darkness. Local authorities received complaints about disturbed burial sites and missing corpses, incidents that were often attributed to Dippel's need for experimental materials. While direct evidence of grave robbing was never established, the consistency of these reports suggests that Dippel's research may have required access to fresh human remains. The castle's residents and nearby villagers reported strange phenomena associated with Dippel's experiments, including unexplained lights, unusual sounds, and foul odors emanating from the workshop areas. Some accounts describe seeing lights moving through the castle at night, accompanied by sounds that suggested mechanical apparatus or chemical processes. These reports contributed to growing local suspicion and fear regarding Dippel's activities. Dippel's research methods combine systematic observation with theoretical speculation in ways that anticipated later scientific approaches, while remaining grounded in alchemical and theological frameworks. He maintained detailed records of his experiments, documenting procedures, observations, and theoretical interpretations with meticulous care. These records, though largely lost to history, apparently provided comprehensive documentation of his attempts to manipulate life and death through chemical and surgical means. The failure of Dippel's soul transfer experiments did not diminish his conviction that such procedures were theoretically possible. He attributed unsuccessful attempts to technical limitations rather than fundamental impossibilities, continuing to refine his methods and develop new approaches to the problem of consciousness manipulation. This persistence in the face of repeated failure reflected both scientific determination and dangerous obsession with forbidden knowledge. Dippel's reputation as a dangerous experimenter spread throughout Germany and beyond, earning him both notoriety and persecution from religious and civil authorities. His unorthodox theological views, combined with rumors about his experimental activities, made him a target for suppression by those who viewed his work as threatening to established order. Multiple attempts were made to arrest him on charges ranging from heresy to necromancy. The connection between Dippel's work and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein remains a subject of scholarly debate, but circumstantial evidence suggests that his story may have influenced the creation of literature's most famous mad scientist. Shelley visited the Rhine Valley in 1814, 4 years before publishing Frankenstein, and would have been familiar with local legends about the castle and its notorious former resident. The similarities between Dippel's experiments and Victor Frankenstein's creation of artificial life are too striking to be entirely coincidental. The scientific legacy of Dippel's work extends beyond its literary influence to include genuine contributions to chemistry and medicine. His oil, despite its dubious therapeutic claims, represented an early example of systematic organic chemistry and may have contained compounds with legitimate pharmacological activity. Modern analysis of similar preparations has identified various organic compounds that possess antimicrobial and other biological properties. Dippel's materialist approach to consciousness and soul, while controversial in his era, anticipated later scientific understanding of the relationship between mind and brain. His conviction that mental phenomena could be understood and manipulated through physical means, though expressed in alchemical rather than modern scientific terms, prefigured contemporary neuroscience and the biological approach to psychology. The ethical implications of Dippel's research were largely ignored in his era, but they raise important questions about the limits of scientific inquiry and the moral responsibility of researchers. His willingness to experiment on human remains, potentially including grave robbing and desecration of corpses, demonstrated the dangers of unchecked intellectual curiosity and the need for ethical constraints on scientific research. The psychological profile of Dippel suggests a complex individual whose genuine intellectual curiosity was combined with grandiose ambitions and insufficient moral restraint. His diverse interests in theology, chemistry, and medicine reflected the interdisciplinary nature of early modern intellectual life. While his controversial experiments revealed the potential for scholarly inquiry to transgress moral and social boundaries, Dippel's ultimate fate remains somewhat mysterious, with various accounts placing his death in different locations and circumstances. Some sources suggest he died in 1734 while conducting alchemical experiments, possibly as a result of exposure to toxic substances produced in his laboratory. Other accounts describe his disappearance under suspicious circumstances, leading to speculation that he may have been murdered by enemies or died while attempting to flee persecution. The castle that witnessed Dippel's experiments continues to dominate the Rhine Valley landscape, now serving as a tourist attraction that capitalizes on its connection to the Frankenstein legend. Visitors can tour the restored chambers and learn about both the historical reality of Dippel's work and its literary transformation into one of fiction's most enduring cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. The story of Johann Conrad Dippel serves as a bridge between the pre-scientific world of alchemy and theology and the modern era of systematic scientific research. His work, while deeply flawed by contemporary standards, reflected the intellectual courage and moral blindness that characterize many pivotal moments in the history of human knowledge. His experiments with life and death, conducted in the shadow of Castle Frankenstein, continue to resonate as a warning about the potential consequences of pursuing knowledge without wisdom, power without responsibility, and scientific progress without ethical constraint. Part 6. Harry Harlow, the monkey torturer of Wisconsin. Harry Frederick Harlow began his career at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1930 as an ambitious young psychologist with what seemed like noble intentions. He wanted to understand the fundamental nature of love, attachment, and human emotional development. What he created instead was a laboratory of horrors that would make even hardened researchers recoil in disgust. Born Harry Israel in 1905, he changed his surname to Harlow after encountering anti-Semitic discrimination early in his academic career. This early experience with cruelty perhaps foreshadowed the callousness he would later display toward his research subjects. Harlow's initial work seemed promising enough. He was studying learning and cognition in rhesus monkeys, establishing what would become one of the most important primate research facilities in America. The turning point came in the 1950s when Harlow became obsessed with understanding maternal attachment. His famous cloth mother experiments initially garnered praise from the scientific community. He separated infant monkeys from their mothers and offered them to surrogate mothers, one made of wire that provided milk, and another made of soft cloth that provided no nourishment. The baby monkeys consistently chose the comfort of the cloth mother over the sustenance of the wire mother, challenging the prevailing behaviorist theories that suggested attachment was purely based on feeding. But Harlow's curiosity quickly transformed into something far more sinister. He began designing increasingly elaborate and cruel experimental apparatus, each one more psychologically devastating than the last. His pit of despair was perhaps the most notorious. This device was essentially a stainless steel chamber shaped like an inverted pyramid, with slippery sides that made escape impossible. Baby monkeys, some as young as a few months old, were placed in complete isolation within these chambers for periods ranging from 30 days to an entire year. The monkeys trapped in these devices had no contact with other living beings, no toys, no stimulation of any kind. They sat in total darkness and silence, with only a small opening at the top for food and water. Harlow meticulously documented what happened to these animals as they descended into madness. They would huddle in corners, rocking back and forth compulsively. They would bite and scratch themselves until they bled. Some would bang their heads against the walls repeatedly. Many refused to eat and had to be force-fed to prevent them from starving to death. When the monkeys were finally released from their isolation chambers, the psychological damage was profound and permanent. They could not interact normally with other monkeys. They showed no interest in play, exploration, or social bonding. Many became aggressive and violent, attacking other monkeys without provocation, female monkeys who had been subjected to this treatment and later became mothers were often abusive to their own offspring, either ignoring them completely or physically attacking them. Harlow seemed almost gleeful in describing these results. He gave his experimental devices sadistic names like the rape rack, a restraining device that held female monkeys immobile for forced mating. He called another apparatus the Iron Maiden, a chamber lined with spikes that would poke the monkeys if they tried to move. His presentations at scientific conferences were filled with dark humor and casual references to the torture he was inflicting. The scientific community's response was disturbingly muted. While some researchers privately expressed discomfort with Harlow's methods, few spoke out publicly. The prevailing attitude was that advancing human knowledge justified almost any means, no matter how cruel. Harlow's work was funded by prestigious institutions, including the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Science Foundation. He received numerous awards and honors throughout his career. What made Harlow's experiments particularly disturbing was their apparent lack of clear scientific purpose. Unlike medical research that might cause suffering but could lead to treatments for disease, Harlow's work seemed driven purely by sadistic curiosity. He already knew from earlier experiments that isolation was harmful to young primates. The Pit of Despair experiments didn't reveal new insights about depression or attachment so much as they demonstrated how thoroughly an animal's spirit could be broken through systematic psychological torture. Harlow's own psychological state became increasingly questionable as his career progressed. He suffered from severe depression and alcoholism, problems that seemed to worsen as his experiments became more extreme. Some colleagues speculated that he was projecting his own psychological pain onto his research subjects, using the monkeys as proxies for his own suffering. His personal relationships were troubled, and he went through multiple divorces. The cultural impact of Harlow's work extended far beyond the laboratory. His findings about the importance of maternal contact and emotional warmth helped challenge the behaviorist orthodoxy that dominated psychology at the time. However, this positive contribution came at an enormous cost in animal suffering. The knowledge gained could almost certainly have been obtained through less invasive methods, particularly through observational studies of naturally occurring situations. By the 1960s and 1970s, as the animal rights movement began to gain momentum, Harlow's work came under increasing scrutiny. Activists picketed his laboratory and demanded that his funding be withdrawn. The emerging field of research ethics began to question whether the knowledge gained from such experiments could ever justify the suffering they caused. New regulations were implemented requiring institutional review of animal research proposals, though these came too late to prevent decades of abuse in Harlow's laboratory. Harlow died in 1981, having spent his final years defending his life's work against mounting criticism. He never expressed regret for the suffering he had caused, instead maintaining that his research had made important contributions to understanding human psychology and development. His legacy remains deeply controversial, with some viewing him as a pioneering researcher who advanced our understanding of attachment and love, while others see him as a sadistic torturer who used scientific respectability to mask his cruelty. The monkeys in Harlow's laboratory never had names, only numbers. This deliberate dehumanization made it easier for researchers to ignore their suffering. But each of those numbers represented an individual creature capable of fear, loneliness, and despair. They experienced terror and isolation, so complete that it drove them to madness. All in service of experiments that revealed little more than the obvious fact that social creatures need social contact to thrive. Part 7. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, and his twins. Joseph Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1943, carrying with him the credentials of a respected physician and the racial theories of Nazi ideology. What he created in the name of science was a hell on earth that defied every principle of medical ethics and human decency. His victims called him the Angel of Death, a title that barely captured the full horror of his actions. Born in 1911 to a wealthy Bavarian family, Mengele had initially seemed destined for a conventional medical career. He earned his doctorate in anthropology from Munich University in 1935 and his medical degree from Frankfurt University in 1938. His early academic work focused on racial theory and genetics, subjects that had become central to Nazi ideology. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1938, rapidly ascending through the ranks due to his combination of medical expertise and ideological fervor. Mengele's assignment to Auschwitz was presented as an opportunity to conduct groundbreaking genetic research using the vast population of prisoners as test subjects. The concentration camp system provided him with something no ethical researcher could ever have access to: unlimited human subjects with no legal protections, no ability to refuse participation, and no oversight of his methods. What he did with this terrible opportunity would earn him a place among history's most notorious war criminals. The selection ramp at Auschwitz became Mengele's first laboratory. As trains arrived carrying thousands of Jewish deportees, he would stand in his immaculate SS uniform, whistling classical music while pointing left or right with his gloved hand. Those directed to the right would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. Those directed to the left would live a bit longer, and some would become subjects in his experiments. But Mengele paid special attention to certain arrivals: twins, dwarves, people with unusual physical characteristics, and children with different colored eyes. Twins held a particular fascination for Mengele because they offered the perfect control group for genetic experiments. Identical twins shared the same DNA, so any differences between them could theoretically be attributed to environmental factors or experimental interventions. Mengele collected twins obsessively, housing them in a special barracks and ensuring they received slightly better food and living conditions than other prisoners. This preferential treatment was not kindness, but simply a way to keep his research subjects healthy enough to endure his experiments. The experiments themselves were beyond comprehension in their cruelty and pointlessness. Mengele would inject dyes into children's eyes to see if he could change their color permanently, causing excruciating pain and often blindness. He performed surgeries without anesthesia, removing organs to examine them or attempting to transplant limbs between twins. He injected various substances into children's spines to induce paralysis or death, carefully documenting the results. Some twins were deliberately infected with diseases to study their progression, while others had their blood slowly drained to see how long they could survive. Perhaps most horrifying were Mengele's attempts to artificially create conjoined twins. He would select healthy children and attempt to surgically fuse them together, connecting their circulatory systems or attempting to graft limbs from one to another. These operations were performed in primitive conditions without proper surgical equipment or sterilization. The The children who survived the initial surgery died within days from infection and shock, their small bodies unable to endure such trauma. Mengel's obsession with eye color led to some of his most sadistic experiments. He was fascinated by heterochromia, a condition where a person has two different colored eyes, believing it might hold clues to understanding genetic inheritance. When he discovered children with this natural condition, he would kill them and remove their eyes to study the pigmentation. He also attempted to create this condition artificially by injecting methylene blue and other chemicals directly into children's eyes, causing agonizing pain and permanent damage. The doctor's interest in growth abnormalities led to equally horrific experiments on people with dwarfism and gigantism. He collected these individuals like specimens, studying their bone structure through painful procedures and eventually killing them to examine their skeletons. Children with any unusual physical characteristics were subjected to exhaustive measurements, X-rays, and invasive examinations. Many were killed simply so Mengele could perform autopsies to study their internal organs. What made Mengel's crimes particularly insidious was his ability to maintain a facade of scientific respectability. He meticulously documented his experiments, took thousands of photographs, and preserved specimens in jars of formaldehyde. He corresponded with legitimate scientists in Germany, sending them samples and data from his work. Some established researchers at prestigious universities accepted and utilized this material, making them complicit in his crimes, even if they never set foot in Auschwitz. The children who survived Mengel's experiments carried both physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from permanent disabilities caused by his procedures. Others were left with deep trauma from witnessing the deaths of their siblings and friends. Twin survivors often described the guilt of having lived when their twin had died, a psychological burden that haunted them for decades. Mengel's experimental methods revealed his complete lack of scientific rigor despite his pretensions to scholarly research. He had no proper control groups, kept inadequate records, and drew conclusions based on ideological preconceptions rather than empirical evidence. His work contributed nothing to legitimate medical knowledge and served only to confirm the racial theories that the Nazi regime wanted to hear. As the war began to turn against Germany, Mengele became increasingly frantic in his experiments. As if sensing that his time was running out, he ordered the killing of entire groups of his research subjects to prevent them from being liberated by advancing Allied forces. In January 1945, as Soviet troops approached Auschwitz, Mengele fled westward, taking with him boxes of his research notes and specimens. After the war, Mengele escaped to South America with the help of a network of Nazi sympathizers. He lived in Argentina and later Paraguay for decades, never facing trial for his crimes. Various intelligence agencies knew of his location, but chose not to pursue him. More interested in the Cold War than in prosecuting war criminals, he died in Brazil in 1979, having lived a comfortable life in exile, while his victims spent their remaining years dealing with the consequences of his cruelty. The search for Mengel's complete research records continues to this day. While some documentation was recovered after the war, much of his work disappeared. Some speculate that he destroyed sensitive materials before fleeing Auschwitz, while others believe that records may still exist in private collections or forgotten archives. The lost documentation represents not just historical evidence, but also medical information that might help treat the lasting effects of his experiments on survivors. The psychological impact of Mengel's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The knowledge that medical professionals, people supposedly dedicated to healing and helping others, could commit such atrocities shattered public trust in the medical profession. The Nuremberg trials established new international standards for medical ethics and research involving human subjects. But the shadow of Mengel's crimes continues to influence medical practice today. Part 8. Sergei Brukhanenko, the man who kept a dog's head alive. In the shadowy laboratories of Stalin's Soviet Union, where the boundaries between science and horror often blurred beyond recognition, Sergei Sergeyevich Brukhanenko conducted experiments that seemed to have been ripped from the pages of Gothic fiction. His most infamous achievement was the development of an artificial blood circulation system called the autojector that could theoretically keep severed organs alive independently from the body. The grainy black and white footage of a disembodied dog's head responding to stimuli remains one of the most disturbing pieces of scientific documentation ever recorded. Born in 1890 in Moscow, Brukhanenko initially trained as a theater director before switching to medicine in his 20s. This background in drama would prove oddly appropriate for the theatrical nature of his later scientific demonstrations. He completed his medical studies just as the Russian Revolution was transforming the country, and, like many intellectuals of his generation, he threw himself into the Soviet project with revolutionary fervor. The new socialist state promised unlimited resources for scientific advancement, free from the ethical constraints that supposedly held back capitalist research. Brukhanenko's early work focused on developing artificial circulation systems for use in surgery. This was legitimate medical research with clear, practical applications. Heart surgery in the 1920s and 1930s was extremely dangerous because surgeons had no way to maintain blood flow to vital organs while operating on the heart itself. An artificial heart-lung machine would allow surgeons to temporarily take over the body's circulatory system, making complex cardiac procedures possible. The autojector that Brukhanenko developed was a primitive but functional heart-lung machine. It consisted of a pump that could circulate blood through an external circuit while adding oxygen and removing carbon dioxide. The device was large and cumbersome, requiring a team of technicians to operate, but it represented a genuine breakthrough in medical technology. However, Brukhanenko's scientific curiosity soon led him down a much darker path. If the autojector could maintain circulation in a living animal during surgery, what would happen if he used it to circulate blood through organs that had been completely separated from the body? This question led to a series of increasingly macabre experiments that would make him the most notorious of these experiments. Involved the complete decapitation of dogs, with their severed heads kept alive through artificial circulation. Brukhanenko would carefully sever the head at the neck, immediately connecting the major blood vessels to his autojector system. The machine would then pump oxygenated blood through the head's circulatory system. The results were both fascinating and horrifying. The severed heads would continue to show signs of life for hours after decapitation. Their eyes would track moving objects, their ears would perk up in response to sounds, and their mouths would react to various stimuli. When researchers placed food near the mouths, the heads would attempt to eat, with the food simply falling out through the severed neck. The heads would react to bright lights by closing their eyes and respond to loud noises with apparent distress. Brukhanenko documented these experiments meticulously, creating detailed notes and photographs of the procedures. More disturbingly, he also created film footage of the living heads, which he would show at scientific conferences and public demonstrations. The black and white movies show the disembodied heads with their eyes open and responsive. The scientific community's reaction to these demonstrations was mixed, but generally positive. Soviet scientists praised Brukhanenko's work as evidence of their nation's technological superiority and revolutionary approach to research. International observers were more disturbed, but also intrigued by the implications. If consciousness could be maintained in a severed head, what did this say about the nature of life and death? Could the technique be applied to humans? Brukhanenko himself was eager to explore this possibility. He began advocating for experiments with human heads, arguing that the technique could be used to preserve the consciousness of brilliant scientists and political leaders after their bodies had died. In the context of 1930s Soviet Union, where Lenin's body had been preserved in a mausoleum and Stalin was increasingly viewed as immortal, such ideas didn't seem entirely far-fetched. The researcher went even further in his ambitions, claiming that he could revive entire animals that had been clinically dead for extended periods. He conducted experiments where dogs were killed through various means, then revived using his autojector system. According to his reports, some animals were successfully brought back to life after being dead for up to 10 minutes, though they often suffered from severe neurological damage. These revival experiments were even more controversial than the severed head studies. Brukhanenko claimed to have developed a technique for what he called restoration of life, which involved rapidly cooling the body after death, then gradually rewarming it while restoring circulation with his artificial heart-lung machine. He reported successful revivals in dozens of dogs, though independent verification of these results was difficult due to the secretive nature of Soviet research. The practical applications of Brukhanenko's work extended beyond mere scientific curiosity. Soviet military leaders were extremely interested in any technique that might help revive soldiers who had been critically wounded in battle. If circulation could be maintained artificially, it might be possible to save lives that would otherwise be lost to shock and blood loss. The ability to keep organs alive outside the body could also revolutionize organ transplantation, allowing surgeons to preserve hearts, livers, and kidneys for extended periods before transplantation. However, the ethical implications of Brukhanenko's research were staggering. Keeping a severed head alive raised fundamental questions about consciousness, suffering, and the definition of death itself. The head would be aware of its situation, but completely unable to interact with the world or control its fate. Though such concerns carried little weight in Stalin's Soviet Union, the researcher himself seemed oblivious to ethical considerations, focusing entirely on the technical challenges and potential applications of his work. He viewed the suffering of his experimental subjects as an acceptable cost for advancing human knowledge and serving the socialist state. The political context of Brukhanenko's work cannot be ignored. Stalin's government was obsessed with demonstrating Soviet technological superiority over the capitalist West, and dramatic scientific achievements served important propaganda purposes. Brukhanenko's experiments were widely publicized as evidence of socialist science's willingness to push boundaries that bourgeois researchers would never dare cross. The graphic footage of his experiments was shown to international visitors as proof of Soviet scientific prowess. Brukhanenko's career reached its peak in the 1940s, when he was appointed to lead a major research institute and received numerous awards from the Soviet government. However, his influence began to wane in the post-war period, as more conventional medical research gained favor. The development of practical heart-lung machines for surgical use made his more extreme experiments seem unnecessary and ethically questionable, even by Soviet standards. He died in 1960, having spent his final years defending his methods against increasing criticism from younger scientists who questioned both the ethics and the scientific value of his experiments. His death marked the end of an era in Soviet research when ideological fervor and political pressure could override normal ethical constraints. The footage of Brukhanenko's severed dog heads continues to circulate today, typically accompanied by disclaimers about its disturbing content. While the images are undeniably horrific, they also represent a unique window into the history of medical research and the development of artificial life support systems. Modern heart-lung machines used in cardiac surgery can trace their lineage back to Brukhanenko's pioneering work, even though his methods would be considered completely unacceptable today. Part 9. Duncan McDougall, the doctor who weighed the soul. In the autumn of 1907, in a small hospital in Haverhill, Massachusetts, Dr. Duncan McDougall conducted one of the most peculiar experiments in medical history. Armed with an industrial scale sensitive to fractions of an ounce and an unshakable belief that the human soul had physical weight, he embarked on a quest to prove scientifically what theologians had debated for millennia. His results would capture the popular imagination for over a century, even as the scientific community dismissed his methods and conclusions as fundamentally flawed. McDougall was not a fringe practitioner or amateur researcher. Born in 1866, he had received a solid medical education and established a respected practice in Massachusetts. He was well regarded by his colleagues and maintained memberships in several professional medical societies. What drove him to attempt weighing the soul was not religious fanaticism, but rather the scientific materialism of his era, which sought to measure and quantify every aspect of human existence. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of tremendous confidence in the power of scientific measurement. Researchers were discovering that phenomena previously considered mystical or spiritual could often be explained through physical processes. Electricity, magnetism, and radioactivity had all been brought within the realm of scientific understanding. McDougall believed that the soul might be similarly measurable, existing as some form of subtle matter that could be detected by sufficiently sensitive instruments. His experimental setup was both ingenious and macabre. McDougall constructed a special bed mounted on a platform scale that could detect weight changes as small as 1/10 of an ounce. The entire apparatus was carefully calibrated and tested to ensure accuracy. He then approached the families of terminally ill patients, requesting permission to monitor their loved ones' final moments for scientific purposes. 6 families agreed to allow their dying relatives to become subjects in this unprecedented experiment. The first patient was a man dying of tuberculosis, a common killer in that era. McDougall moved him onto the specially constructed bed and began monitoring his vital signs, while simultaneously tracking any changes in weight. For several hours, the scale showed no significant variation as the patient's condition gradually deteriorated. Then, at the moment of death, something extraordinary happened. The scale suddenly dropped by 3/4 of an ounce, or approximately 21 grams. McDougall was electrified by this result. Here was apparent proof that something measurable had left the body at the moment of death. He immediately began preparing for additional experiments, convinced that he was on the verge of a revolutionary scientific discovery. The weight loss couldn't be explained by the cessation of breathing or other obvious physiological changes, which had been accounted for in his experimental design. The second patient, a woman also dying of tuberculosis, showed similar results. At the moment of death, the scale registered a weight loss of half an ounce. The third patient lost 3/8 of an ounce. McDougall was beginning to see a pattern, though the exact amounts varied between subjects. He theorized that the differences might be due to variations in soul size, or perhaps measurement errors inherent in detecting such a subtle phenomenon. However, the fourth and fifth experiments produced ambiguous results. One patient showed no measurable weight loss at death, while another showed fluctuations that were difficult to interpret. McDougall attributed these failures to problems with his equipment or interference from other factors. The sixth experiment had to be abandoned when family members became too distressed to allow the monitoring to continue until the moment of death. Despite the mixed results, McDougall was convinced that he had proven the existence of the soul as a measurable physical entity. He calculated an average weight loss of 21 grams across his successful experiments and began preparing to publish his findings. The number 21 grams would become permanently associated with his research. Though it represented an average of widely varying measurements from a tiny sample size, McDougall's scientific methodology was deeply flawed by modern standards. His sample size was absurdly small, with only 6 subjects and questionable results from several of them. He had no control group and no way to verify that weight loss at death wasn't caused by other factors, such as the evaporation of bodily fluids or the release of gases from the digestive system. His scale, while sensitive for its time, was not nearly precise enough to detect the minute changes he was claiming to measure. More problematically, McDougall had formed his conclusion before conducting the experiments and then interpreted ambiguous data to support his predetermined beliefs. When results didn't match his expectations, he found reasons to dismiss them rather than considering that his hypothesis might be wrong. This confirmation bias made his research scientifically worthless, regardless of how carefully he believed he was conducting his measurements. Undeterred by these methodological problems, McDougall decided to expand his research to animals. If humans possessed souls that had measurable weight, what about other creatures? He began conducting similar experiments with dogs, using larger scales to accommodate their size. The results were dramatically different from his human subjects. The dogs showed no measurable weight loss at death, leading McDougall to conclude that animals did not possess souls, at least not in the same way that humans did. This finding aligned perfectly with McDougall's religious and philosophical beliefs about the unique spiritual nature of humanity. Rather than considering that the weight loss in humans might have been caused by purely physical factors that affected humans differently than dogs, he interpreted the results as confirmation of mankind's special place in creation. The fact that his animal experiments showed no weight loss should have raised serious questions about his human experiments. But McDougall was too invested in his conclusions to reconsider his methods. Word of McDougall's experiments began to spread through both scientific and popular media. The idea that the soul could be weighed captured public imagination in a way that few scientific studies ever have. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about the doctor who had proven the existence of the soul, and McDougall found himself thrust into the spotlight as a celebrity scientist. The scientific community's response was far more skeptical. Fellow physicians and researchers quickly identified the numerous flaws in McDougall's methodology and pointed out that his results could be explained by mundane physiological processes. The American Medical Association published criticisms of his work, and several researchers attempted to replicate his experiments with more rigorous controls. None of these replication attempts produced similar results. McDougall spent the remaining years of his career defending his findings and attempting to conduct follow-up studies. He proposed using X-rays to photograph the soul leaving the body, and experimented with more sensitive scales to detect smaller weight changes. However, he was never able to reproduce his original results with greater scientific rigor, and interest in his work gradually faded within the medical community. The doctor's personal motivation for conducting these experiments remains somewhat mysterious. Unlike many researchers of his era who were trying to debunk religious beliefs through scientific investigation, McDougall seemed genuinely committed to proving the existence of the soul. He was a practicing Christian who apparently saw his research as supporting rather than challenging religious doctrine. This may have made him more susceptible to seeing the results he wanted to see. McDougall died in 1920, still convinced that he had made a revolutionary scientific discovery. His obituaries in medical journals were respectful, but made little mention of his soul-weighing experiments, which were already considered an embarrassing episode in his otherwise respectable career. However, his work lived on in popular culture, where the idea of the 21-gram soul became a persistent myth. The legend of McDougall's experiments has proven remarkably durable, surviving more than a century of scientific debunking. The concept has been referenced in movies, books, and songs, often with the implication that science has somehow proven the existence of the soul. This persistence demonstrates the powerful appeal of the idea that spiritual concepts might be measurable and quantifiable. Modern scientists who have examined McDougall's work note that it represents a classic example of how personal beliefs can contaminate supposedly objective research. His experiments violated virtually every principle of good scientific methodology, from inadequate sample sizes to lack of proper controls to confirmation bias in interpreting results. Yet the emotional appeal of his conclusions has allowed them to survive in popular consciousness long after they were discredited scientifically. The physiological explanations for the weight changes McDougall observed are now well understood. At death, the body undergoes numerous changes that could account for small variations in weight. The cessation of perspiration, changes in blood distribution, the release of gases from the digestive system, and other factors could all contribute to apparent weight loss. More sensitive modern scales have detected these changes, but found them to be inconsistent and easily explained by known biological processes. Perhaps most tellingly, subsequent researchers, using more rigorous methodology, have found no consistent weight change at death in either humans or animals. Studies with proper controls, larger sample sizes, and more sensitive equipment have consistently failed to replicate McDougall's results. The scientific consensus is that his findings were the result of measurement errors, equipment problems, and wishful thinking, rather than the detection of departing souls. Part 10. Andrija Puharich, Mind Control, Aliens, and the CIA. In the paranoid atmosphere of Cold War America, where the line between legitimate research and science fiction often blurred beyond recognition, Dr. Andrija Puharich carved out a unique and troubling niche as a researcher of psychic phenomena, mind control, and alleged extraterrestrial communication. His work intersected with some of the most secretive government programs of the 20th century, including the CIA's notorious MK Ultra project, while simultaneously diving deep into the world of UFO contactees and psychic research. The result was a career that straddled the boundaries between legitimate science, government-sponsored mind control experiments, and outright fantasy. Born Henry Karol Puharich in 1918 to Croatian immigrant parents in Chicago, he would later change his name to the more exotic Andrija, perhaps reflecting his lifelong fascination with the mysterious and otherworldly. His early academic career showed genuine promise. He earned a medical degree from Northwestern University in 1947 and initially focused on conventional medical research, particularly in the field of hearing and acoustics. His doctoral thesis on the electrical properties of the ear was well regarded, and he seemed destined for a respectable career in medical research. However, Puharich's interests began to drift toward more unconventional territories almost immediately after completing his medical training. He became fascinated with the work of Edgar Cayce, the famous sleeping prophet, who claimed to diagnose illnesses and provide medical advice while in trance states. This interest in psychic phenomena would come to dominate his career, leading him away from mainstream medicine and toward the shadowy world of parapsychology and government-sponsored research into the paranormal. In the early 1950s, Puharich established the Round Table Foundation of Electrobiology in Glen Cove, Maine, ostensibly to study the relationship between electricity and biological processes. In reality, the foundation became a testing ground for psychic research and drug experimentation. Puharich was particularly interested in the potential for certain drugs to enhance psychic abilities, and he began conducting experiments with various substances, including early investigations into the effects of LSD and other hallucinogens on human consciousness. These drug experiments would prove to be Puharich's entry point into the world of CIA-sponsored research. In the early 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a massive secret program called MK Ultra, designed to explore the possibilities of mind control and psychological warfare. The program encompassed hundreds of sub-projects conducted at universities, hospitals, and private research facilities across the country, often without the knowledge or consent of the subjects involved. Puharich became a contractor for MK Ultra, conducting experiments on the effects of various drugs on human consciousness and behavior. His research focused particularly on LSD, mescaline, and other psychoactive substances administered to both willing volunteers and unwitting subjects. The goal was to determine whether these drugs could be used to break down psychological resistance, implant false memories, or otherwise control human behavior for intelligence purposes. The ethical violations involved in this research were staggering. Even by the relaxed standards of the 1950s, Puharich and other MK Ultra researchers administered powerful psychoactive drugs to subjects without their knowledge, observed them as they experienced terrifying hallucinations and psychological breakdowns, and documented the results for potential use in interrogation and mind control. Many subjects suffered lasting psychological damage, and some may have died as a result of the experiments. One of Puharich's most notorious subjects was a young artist named Robert Hyde, whom he dosed with LSD without Hyde's knowledge during a social gathering. Hyde experienced a complete psychological breakdown, becoming convinced that he was losing his mind and contemplating suicide. Only after several hours of terror did Puharich reveal that Hyde had been drugged, by which point the damage to his psyche was already done. This incident, while extreme, was typical of the callous disregard for human welfare that characterized much of the MK-Ultra program. Puharich's involvement with MK-Ultra led him deeper into the world of intelligence operations and secret research. He developed contacts within the CIA and other government agencies, becoming known as someone who could conduct sensitive research with few questions asked. His medical credentials and scientific background provided a veneer of respectability for experiments that might otherwise have been dismissed as torture or abuse. However, Puharich's interests extended far beyond simple drug research. He became increasingly convinced that the human mind possessed latent psychic abilities that could be unlocked through the right combination of drugs, technology, and training. He began experimenting with electromagnetic fields, ultra-low frequency sound waves, and other exotic technologies, believing they could enhance telepathy, clairvoyance, and other paranormal abilities. This research brought Puharich into contact with Uri Geller, the Israeli performer who claimed to possess genuine psychic powers, particularly the ability to bend spoons and other metal objects through mental force alone. Puharich became Geller's patron and promoter, conducting numerous experiments to test his abilities and publishing a book claiming that Geller's powers were real and scientifically verifiable. While many investigators later concluded that Geller was simply a skilled magician using traditional conjuring techniques, Puharich remained convinced of his psychic abilities. The Geller connection led Puharich into even stranger territory. During their work together, both men claimed to receive telepathic communications from extraterrestrial intelligences. According to Puharich, these alien entities identified themselves as representatives of an advanced civilization that was monitoring human development and occasionally intervening to guide human evolution. The aliens allegedly communicated through various means, including direct telepathic contact, electronic voice phenomena, and mysterious radio transmissions. Puharich became obsessed with these alleged alien communications, spending increasing amounts of time and energy trying to decode their messages and understand their purpose. He claimed that the extraterrestrials were warning humanity about impending disasters and offering guidance on how to develop psychic abilities that would be necessary for survival in the coming cosmic age. These beliefs put Puharich at the center of the emerging UFO contactee movement of the 1960s and 1970s. He became a regular speaker at UFO conferences and developed relationships with other contactees who claimed similar alien communications. His medical credentials and scientific background lent credibility to these claims in the eyes of believers, even as mainstream scientists dismissed them as delusions or hoaxes. The contradiction between Puharich's government work and his alien contact claims created a strange duality in his career. By day, he was conducting secret research for intelligence agencies, exploring the possibilities of mind control and psychological warfare. By night, he was channeling messages from space beings and promoting psychic research. Some observers speculated that his alien contact claims were themselves part of a government disinformation campaign designed to discredit genuine research into mind control by associating it with UFO nonsense. This theory gained credence when it was revealed that several other MK Ultra researchers had also become involved in UFO research and alien contact claims. The pattern suggested that the CIA might have been deliberately promoting these beliefs to muddy the waters around their secret research programs. If researchers could be dismissed as UFO cranks, their revelations about government mind control experiments would carry less weight with the public and media. Puharich's research methods became increasingly unorthodox as his career progressed. He began using psychic subjects as research assistants, claiming that their abilities allowed them to access information that conventional scientific instruments could not detect. He developed elaborate theories about the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic fields, and quantum mechanics, publishing papers that were largely ignored by mainstream scientists, but eagerly embraced by the parapsychology community. One of his most ambitious projects involved attempts to create artificial telepathy using electronic devices. Puharich theorized that the human brain operated on specific electromagnetic frequencies, and that these frequencies could be detected, recorded, and transmitted using the right equipment. He spent considerable time and money developing prototype devices that he claimed could facilitate telepathic communication between distant subjects. These experiments led to some of Puharich's most controversial claims. He alleged that he had successfully demonstrated telepathic communication over distances of hundreds of miles using his electronic amplification devices. He also claimed to have recorded the electromagnetic signatures of various psychic phenomena, including out-of-body experiences and communications with deceased individuals. However, these claims were never successfully replicated under controlled conditions, and most scientists dismissed them as the result of equipment malfunction or experimental error. The 1970s marked the peak of Puharich's influence in both the intelligence community and the paranormal research field. He continued to receive government funding for his research, while simultaneously becoming one of the most prominent advocates for the reality of psychic phenomena. His books on Uri Geller and alien contact became bestsellers, and he was frequently quoted in media coverage of paranormal topics. However, this period also marked the beginning of Puharich's decline, as the MK Ultra program came under increasing scrutiny from Congress and the media. Government agencies began distancing themselves from researchers associated with the program's most controversial aspects. Puharich's overt involvement in UFO research and alien contact claims made him a liability, and his government funding began to dry up. The revelations about MK Ultra that emerged during the Church Committee investigations of the mid-1970s cast a harsh light on Puharich's earlier research. Documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed the extent of his involvement in drug experiments and mind control research, including his use of unwitting subjects and his collaboration with other researchers who had conducted some of the program's most notorious experiments. These revelations severely damaged Puharich's credibility in both the scientific and paranormal research communities. Critics argued that his psychic research had been contaminated by his involvement in government mind control programs, and that his claims about alien contact might have been cover stories for more conventional intelligence operations. Some former subjects of his experiments came forward with allegations of abuse and exploitation, further tarnishing his reputation. Puharich spent his later years attempting to rehabilitate his image and continue his research with limited resources. He established several small research organizations and continued to publish papers on consciousness and psychic phenomena, but his work was increasingly marginalized by mainstream science. He also became involved in various conspiracy theories, claiming that government agencies were actively suppressing his research and persecuting him for his discoveries. The personal toll of his controversial career was evident in Puharich's declining mental and physical health. He became increasingly paranoid, claiming that he was under surveillance by various government agencies and that his research was being sabotaged by unknown enemies. Friends and colleagues noted dramatic changes in his personality and behavior, suggesting that his years of drug experimentation and involvement in secret research may have taken a significant psychological toll. Puharich's influence on the development of both government mind control research and the modern UFO movement cannot be understated. His work helped establish many of the theoretical foundations for CIA research into psychological warfare and behavior modification. While his promotion of psychic research and alien contact claims helped shape popular beliefs about these phenomena that persist to this day, the ethical implications of Puharich's research remain deeply troubling. His willingness to experiment on unwitting subjects with dangerous psychoactive drugs represents a profound violation of medical ethics and human rights. The fact that this research was conducted with government approval and funding raises serious questions about the oversight of scientific research and the protection of human subjects. Modern researchers studying the history of MK-Ultra and related programs have identified Puharich as one of the key figures in the development of psychological warfare techniques that were later used by intelligence agencies around the world. His research contributed to the development of interrogation methods, behavior modification techniques, and other forms of psychological manipulation that have been used in various conflicts and intelligence operations. At the same time, Puharich's promotion of psychic research and alien contact claims has had a lasting impact on popular culture and belief systems. His books and lectures helped establish many of the tropes and beliefs that continue to characterize the UFO community and New Age movement. The idea that extraterrestrial beings are in telepathic contact with selected humans, offering guidance and warnings about humanity's future, can be traced directly to Puharich's work in the 1960s and 1970s. Puharich died in 1995, having spent his final years in relative obscurity. His death received little notice in mainstream media, but was mourned by believers in psychic phenomena and UFO researchers who continued to view him as a pioneering scientist who had been unfairly persecuted for his unconventional ideas. His papers and research materials were scattered among various archives and private collectors, making it difficult for researchers to fully evaluate his contributions to both legitimate science and fringe research. The legacy of Andrzej Puharich serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of scientific research conducted without proper ethical oversight. His career demonstrates how the pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from moral considerations and accountability, can lead to serious harm to both research subjects and society as a whole. At the same time, his story illustrates the complex relationship between legitimate scientific inquiry and the exploration of phenomena that lie at the margins of accepted knowledge. Today, As concerns about government surveillance and mind control continue to influence public discourse, Puharich's research takes on new relevance. His work anticipated many of the technologies and techniques that are now used for data collection, behavioral analysis, and psychological influence. The questions he raised about the nature of consciousness, the possibilities of technological mind control, and the relationship between science and intelligence operations remain as pertinent today as they were during the height of the Cold War. Whether viewed as a pioneering researcher, a government stooge, or a deluded conspiracy theorist, Andrija Puharich undoubtedly left a significant mark on both the scientific establishment and popular culture. His work serves as a reminder of the complex ethical and philosophical questions that arise when science ventures into the realm of consciousness, behavior modification, and the outer limits of human experience. Thanks for watching No Sleep Historian. Like and subscribe for more history they wanted you to forget. Until next time, sleep tight if you still can.